It's great to be here. I remember de Kooning once said something about it. You never could sit in a comfortable chair. You had to sit on the edge. I feel that way right now, so what the heck. Well, I want to thank the Strand for hosting this, which is really nice to have done. And Nora for coming along. We'll add a lot of depth to what we're talking about. And I also want to especially thank Gerhard Steidl, who's not here tonight. He's the publisher. He's an amazing person who makes books that are so good, and he makes the books not because he's the publisher to make money. He makes the books to help an artist get their work out. I think the word they use is to realize your book. There is a word. I think the French word for a director is a real. How do you say it? Real. Anyhow, it's not making it real, but realize it the way you intended it. So I feel very privileged and happy to work with Steidl. And what's so curious and nice about working with him is that no two of his books come out the same. And he has a huge range of different photographers, all different from each other, each interesting as can be. And they're the best that can be. So I'm very, very thankful for him for doing this book now. And I think the format is Nora and me will talk for about 20, 25 minutes, and then hopefully you'll ask good questions so we have something useful to say. I'm trying to think where I can begin on this book. Initially, Steidl knew of my old photographs of Bob Dylan from 1962. Photographs that I took just down the street here. Maybe some of you might know them. And that was the original intent of the book. And then I started looking at the book, and I realized something, that the photographs that I had taken of Woody Guthrie in 1961 were only 6 months away from the pictures I took of Bob Dylan. In my mind, all these years, those were different worlds. One was Woody at the end of his life, and one was this young guy who needed pictures. But over the distance of time now, or the space of time, it's really interesting to put them together, so that in a way the underlying message of the book is Woody at the end of his career and Bob at the beginning of his, and they have both become such important. Was it okay before? All right. I should know how to use a microphone from years of singing on the stage. I'm always afraid to get too close on to get the last singer's germs. I don't want to do that. Where was I?
Transition.
Yeah, so the transition between Bob and Woody. And when I first photographed Bob, in the early section of the book, he hadn't made his first record yet, so he'd been playing around the city, and he was a character mostly known as a Woody imitator, or descendant. And that was fascinating to watch, and that entered into my photographs. So we'll get to that in a moment, because the other thing that I realized as I started to put together the book for Steidl was that I also have a whole large set of photographs of Bob Dylan 8 years later, in 1970, that Bob had asked me to take. And so in the period between 62 and 70, he had become world famous. But he then asked me to photograph him just on a very one-to-one human basis. So in a strange way, I have that beginning and an ending of the book, early Dylan in conjunction with Woody, and then Dylan a number of years later. I saw Bob at a concert 2 nights ago. He's still another person. He's much older and wiser and very, very challenging still. So where to begin?
So the circumstances of the first photographs that I took of Bob on my rooftop, which is just down here on 3rd Avenue between 9th and 10th Street. Was anybody around in those days to remember that? That was the time when there was all the art galleries, on 10th, the cooperative galleries, and there was the Artist Club, the Cedar Bar, the beginning of the happenings in the pop art world, and we filmed Pull My Daisy, all at the same time. And then I would walk over to Washington Square and hang out on McDougal Street where the coffee houses and Izzy Young's Folklore Center were. So that was kind of my world when I wasn't on the road with the New York City Ramblers, and we traveled all over the place planting ideas about old-time music. But in a way, I haven't gotten to the Bob Dylan photographs yet, but I'm thinking, in a way, I was going to be a photographer, and then I decided not to when I saw how the magazines worked. I saw the kind of assignments that they gave, and I knew I wouldn't fit into that, and I knew I was not interested in covering news, and I just was interested in doing what I was interested in, which happened to be music at that time. I've lost my thread, but it's good. It's a very complicated thread. Well, anyhow, so Bob had played at Gertie's Folk City, and he got a nice review in the New York Times the first time he was noticed, and then somehow I was asked to photograph him. I know I didn't ask to photograph him, and he didn't ask to photograph me. It took many years before I realized that probably Sing Out magazine, a little folk music magazine, was doing the first article about him back then. And it's interesting, I took a nice set of photographs, and Bob's management, he had management, I didn't know that, they didn't particularly like the pictures, or didn't dislike them. It didn't fit the image that they were trying to convey, and Bob didn't have an image yet anyhow. It was interesting, so that so they didn't use my photographs, and I said, good. And I put them away for 25 years. I didn't look at them. And then when my daughter grew up and went to college, her boyfriend was into Bob Dylan. He said, Pop, you got these pictures of Dylan. Why don't you print them up for my boyfriend? I said, I'm not printing pictures for your boyfriend. So you got to come and work with me in the darkroom. And that's when I found out when I had a good set of pictures. And because Bob had become so much in the years in between, but I had no idea what he was going to become. So in a way, the session that we did was very intimate and private and fun and unpredictable. And I remember the feeling that when I was photographing him on my roof and in my loft also on 3rd Avenue, I could see the Woody Guthrie aspect of him. I could see kind of a Charlie Chaplin aspect because he was a funny guy. And then I started to notice, you know, the back of my head, I'm taking pictures in a hurry. James Dean, rebel without a cause. There was some side of him that was not revealed when he sang in those days, but I was seeing it. And I didn't mention it, but you know, you editorialize as you photograph, you make selections. And it's interesting because since there was no purpose for the photographs, there was no image of Bob yet, so it was on a very, very intuitive basis that those pictures were taken. And I think because of it, I never wanted to photograph musicians on the stage because they were packaged when they're on the stage. And for me, just to have this opportunity to go one-on-one with the subject or musician was a good thing. Many years later, when Bob's book came out, what was it, 5 years ago? What do you call it? Chronicles, Volume 1. That's when I learned that he already knew who I was before he came to New York, but he never let on, which is cool. And so you know, and we were walking both sides of the line, and I also at that time I was getting ready to make my first motion picture. I was going to go to Kentucky, and I got a camera, and I'll name drop the camera. I rented it from Al Mazel's. I shared it with Robert Frank and Herbert Matter, and Danny Lyons borrowed it. So that camera had a lot of, and it's now at Duke University for the graduate students to use. But I had to test the camera out. So I asked Bob to come over, and I was going to shoot a little sound film of him, but the tape recorder didn't work. And at that moment, I said, oh my God, here I got this guy, got the camera set up. It's not going to have sound. I'll make it like a silent movie. I just got that idea, make it look like a silent movie, things that I'd seen as a kid. And I tested 2 rolls of film. One of them has disappeared. I think it exists, but I don't know who has it. What? No. Okay, big digression, now that we're on that subject. We got time to kill it. The painter Bryce Martin gave a talk at Purchase College years ago where I was teaching, and said, Bryce, I don't know if you know me, my name is oh yeah, you made that film of Bob Dylan on the roof, you know, when you can see Pablo Frank and the flower, and then from the Kooning studio. I said, oh. I said, where did you see that film? Because that's the one that's missing. He said, oh, I don't remember. I said, well, can you remember who stood here and who stood there? Gee, I don't have any memory. Because if I knew where he was standing, then I would know whether he had seen the event or had seen the film. But that's an unsolved mystery. But the other role that existed is pretty wonderful anyhow. And they used it in the Scorsese film about Bob. Well, so the first part of the book is these nice photographs of Bob. Sometimes he's being funny, sometimes he's not. And I intermixed them in the book with my pictures of Woody. I was so close. Woody meant so much to me ever since I started with this kind of music. I started with this kind of music in '48. And Woody Guthrie and old-time hillbilly music were the first records I heard, even before I heard Pete Seeger. That was kind of a blessing. I knew it before I knew the mainstream look of folk music. And I don't know who let me know that Woody was out there wandering on his own. You know, there was no Woody Guthrie Foundation yet. I didn't know if Harold Leventhal was taking care of Woody or anything. But I went out to Greystone. Sometimes I would take Woody out and bring him to concerts in New York. It was almost embarrassing. You just go up to this, what do you call it, a mental institution? And I'd like to take Woody Guthrie out. Hey, let's get Woody. Just take him out like a library book. I didn't sign any papers. It was really interesting. And I'd bring him into New York to concerts, some, and then bring him back. And then also he hung out with the Gleasons, this wonderful couple in New Jersey, would have him come over on Sundays. And some of us in the city would come out and visit Woody. Apparently at the same time that Bob Dylan was visiting Woody. And I was there when Jack Elliott had just returned from Europe, and he came over to visit Woody. I took some nice pictures of them reuniting. And I kind of felt that in those pictures, like Jack was standing in for me. What I felt about Woody, Jack was really acting it out. And I never wanted to show Woody in his weakness. You know, he had this terrible Huntington's, and he couldn't control his muscles or his voice. And I never wanted to show photographs of that. I always looked to see if I could see some of what I considered his dignity and his strength. And that's the pictures I took of Woody. There was one photograph that I took, and the light was so bad and I was unprepared, and the negative was thin. Negative, that's the opposite of a positive in the days of photography before digital. And it was thin means it wasn't thick. and you could hold it up and it just looked almost like clear. But you held it in the right light and you saw this very curious portrait, profile of Woody. And a wonderful printer named Sid Kaplan, who lives around here somewhere, he took the negative recently and intensified it. Did something, some chemical thing, and made a very beautiful print, which is in the book for the first time. And what can I say? Oh, in the book, there's a picture of Woody that was taken in Washington Square in 1953 by a guy named Arthur Dubinsky. There's another photograph by Arthur with Woody, and Woody was in really unusual shape. He was no longer a Dust Bowl balladeer. He was, to me, he looked like one of those guys in Picasso's Blue period with a big shaggy beard and curly hair, really lost looking. He had been in Florida and had burned his arm, and couldn't play, and he was there in the square. And I was so touched by how he looked. It was so different from what I'd been raised on, about what he was supposed to look like, that I then published those pictures in Sing Out magazine. And I called it Woody Guthrie, Another Image. And along with pictures of him looking not like a Dust Bowl guy at all, I also added 2 verses to the song This Land Is Your Land, the 2 verses that weren't being sung, because at that time, correct me if I'm right, correct me if I'm wrong, they were hoping to make it, to get the song into all the schools and like have it like a national anthem. And so they kind of cleaned up 2 verses. The one about, I kept on walking and a big wall stopped me. On the front side said private property. Backside it didn't say nothing. This land was made for you and me. And then the verse about, on a Sunday morning in the shadow of the steeple by the relief office, I saw the people and they stood hungry and I stood wondering if this land was made for you and me. So I put that out real big in Sing Out magazine with a shaggy looking Woody, called it Another Image. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I took the photographs of Woody towards the end of his life. I think just shortly before he passed, he had gotten this award from the Department of the Interior. So Harold Leventhal asked me to come out and photograph that. And those photographs are rather prophetic. You can see one corner Woody, the picture's in the book, Woody holding hands with Margie, holding the big plaque in front of him, and Harold Leventhal beaming on me, and Arlo in the corner, he was like 14 years old, 15, bangs and long hair, kind of looking on, saying, what the...
Street look.
Street look?
Carnaby Street.
Carnaby Street. Maybe it was, yeah, maybe by then. I don't know. But anyhow, so that's in the book. And I was just at these events. I never was a rock photographer. I was never a star photographer. I was never a hired photographer. And over time I realized that the thing that I can do best is be true to my own desires, follow my own path. And that's sort of what I did. And then in the book there's some pictures of McDougal Street and the Greenbrier Boys and Bob Dylan clowning around in a coffee house. And then, well, there's pictures of Pete Seeger and Alan Lomax together preparing for a concert. Just the big heavy honchos of the music. But I was just there. And then the book moves to the family dog on the Great Highway in San Francisco. Anybody ever hear of that? Family dog? And there's all the members of all the different big rock and roll organizations. The Fillmore West had closed, and they had gotten together. There's Jerry Garcia arguing with Chet Helms and Stephen Gaskin. Are these ringing any bells? Stephen Gaskin.
Only some of us. Only if you're old enough.
Yeah, but if you're wise enough, you can look at the pictures and get the whole story. But it was great. There's Jerry in a t-shirt arguing with these other guys about what their next move is going to be. The next day they flew off to Woodstock. but I didn't get to Woodstock, but I just had, so those pictures are in the book, and then the book moves into something called Sky River Rock and Lighter Than Air Fair, a big rock festival, folk rock festival outside of Seattle. And that's where I saw the counterculture in its full glory and photographed it with innocent eyes and included all the posters from that time in the book. Steidl just took all the graphics that I had collected and put them into the book. Oh, and in the middle of, I forgot, in the middle of all this, when I was still in New York City, we formed something called the Friends of Old Time Music. Anybody remember that? One. Ed Grosden remembers that. Our job was to dismantle the folk revival, to pull the rug out from underneath the Kingston Trio, even the Weavers, under all Judy Collins, the Limelighters. We just put on concerts of traditional musicians from Kentucky, from Mississippi. We had a concert with Mississippi John Hurt and Doc Boggs together at NYU. Last time they had played in New York was in 1927. So, and that's when Clarence Ashley's concert first came out. That's when we first discovered sort of Doc Watson. So it's a whole section of the book about the Friends of Old Time Music. Then the book shifts away from the rock and roll to just music events at my little loft down here, just the day before Mike Seeger's wedding. And we're all sitting around playing songs and Carter family songs. So I put in pictures of that as well. And then Robert Frank had taken a lot of nice photographs of the Ramblers. He was my neighbor. So he took photographs for our covers. So I included some of them in the book. And then was the Portable Folk Festival. A whole bunch of people, friends from Berkeley, California, would get in a bus, travel across America, and do house concerts all across America, in backyards, and sometimes at little festivals. And by the time they got to my house, we had just dug a new pond, and it was all mud. So they all stripped and just covered each other with mud. And it was a big naked mud party. It was wonderful. And the only people wearing clothes was my 3-year-old daughter and her friend. That's in the book. And then it comes to Bob. Bob calls me up in 1970. Said, John, I need more pictures. Okay. He said, can you come to New York, bring a camera where you can take pictures from a block away. Okay. I think he meant get a telephoto lens, which I didn't have. I rented one, and I put it on a camera that didn't have a single lens reflex, so I had to just take photographs from a block away of Bob walking up and down the streets. And it was, crazy. Couldn't speak to him, couldn't direct him, he couldn't talk to me. But we knew that was our agenda. And I realized, I think his idea was to show that he could walk through the streets of New York and not be noticed at all, as long as there wasn't a camera on him. And that was fun. And then he came up to my house where the mud party had been, my chickens, my dogs, my hat, my barn, and I took photographs of him there. And I brought all these slides into New York, and we looked at them together. He said, oh, these are good. Could I show them to my management? Sure. And then they used a few of them in his old album, Self-Portrait. I said, can I have my slides back? No. Bob Dylan office claims to own any pictures of Bob Dylan. I said, well, I didn't know that. And then we got into a little bit of a tiff. I didn't want to get too much of a tiff. And then I said, well, why do you want to control these pictures? Well, we don't want people putting out unauthorized T-shirts and posters. I said, okay, that's business if you want to do that. But I said, but if I ever need them for my own purpose as an artist, then they're mine. Okay. And there's management change, but I kept telling the story over and over again to the new management, and so they all accepted that fact. And just last year, they reissued his album, they call it now Another Self-Portrait, and they used 60 of my slides that they'd had all these years. And then they gave them back to me, so I put them in a book. And that's where we got to the end of the book. Except at the very end of the book, after all that, is a long interview I did with Bob in 1968. Really interesting. So that's what the book is about. Buy that book. Now, that's just for a start. I think I'd like you to meet Nora Guthrie and see what Nora, how she can disprove what I just said, or add or subtract from it. Now I can sit back.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Gosh. Well, I met John when I was a little girl. And we were living out. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. We were living out in Queens at the time, in Howard Beach, the infamous Howard Beach. Some of you might know it from The Godfather, John Gotti, Dapper Don, who lived down the street from us. And on Sunday afternoons, we would bring my dad home from the hospital, and we would try to organize these hootenannies, or times when people could come out and visit with him, mostly his old friends like Pete Seeger and Sonny Terry and Brown and McGee, people like that. And then over the years, the next generation started coming out. And it kind of became word of mouth. It was never advertised in the Village Voice or anything, but it became word of mouth through people like Dave Van Ronk, that Woody was seeing people on Sundays. And I'll tell you, in those days, for anyone to make the trek out to Howard Beach, it's the end of the line of the A train, and then you had to take a bus, and then you had to walk across a marsh. So you had to be somewhat committed if you wanted to see Woody. And a lot of times, mostly all the times, these people were carrying many instruments with them. So it really was, in a way, a pilgrimage of sorts, that people would make this effort to come out and sit with my dad and play music. And
Hey, Nora, I just remembered, because you mentioned that. When I went to visit Woody that time, I was about to do our first cross-country drive with the New York City Ramblers. And I says to Woody, "Hey Woody, I'm driving across the country. Is there anybody I should see?" He says, "Yeah, you should see my cousin Jeff." I said, "Where is he?" "Oh, he's in Colorado." "Well, how do I find him?" "I'll just get into Denver and drive wildly and beep your horn loud, and then they'll arrest you, take you to the jail, and my cousin Jeff is the jailer." Sorry.
I'm going to trigger some more of that from you. So that's what would happen on Sundays. People would come out, and John was one of the many, many, many young guys that came out. I don't know, maybe you were all of 19?
I was probably more than that.
20? Whatever. But usually it was like the kids from like 17 to maybe 22, 23, something like that. Like the next generation. And the thing that our job was to be nice. Our job was to be polite and make sure everyone had coffee and stuff like that. But to be honest, one of the family jokes we have is that they would be sitting around like in a circle in the living room, jamming and playing music, and I hated it, and because there was so much tuning. If any of you were at an early folk scene in the 60s and 70s, there was just like endless like go around the room looking at nobody's talking, because folk musicians tend not to talk a lot, but they tune a lot. And it was just like living with a swarm of bees, you know. So
Hey Nora, here's a memory. The first time I ever laid eyes on Woody was in 1950. There was a memorial concert for Lead Valley, and Woody was on it, and the Weavers and Pete and Sonny and Brownie, and Gary Davis made his first appearance that night. But Woody was playing with Tom Paley in those days, and they were on the stage, and Tom had the stage strewn full of instruments, and during everybody else's act, Tom was busy tuning the instruments. I didn't believe it, but
This is the most singular reason I didn't go into music. I just I could do anything else with music except play a damn guitar, because the tuning that must have been traumatic for me. But the other thing that was cute was that, talk about this transition of time from the 50s into the 60s, because when we were little, my mom used to take us into all the clubs in the Dougal Street, even though we were more than underage. We were like 7, 8, 9, something like that. And we would go to, Gertie's, and we would go to the Gaslight and all that place. And I remember, because they were like the owners were like second cousins type of feeling. They were great uncles or something like that. And I remember, I can still hear the tone of voice going into the Gaslight one night. And Sonny Terry was doing a sound check. And somebody said, "Hey, Sonny, Margie's here with the kids." And Sonny goes, "Oh, the Guthrie kids are here, the Guthrie kids. We get them hot chocolate. Get them hot chocolate." And so it was just the most loving scene, because my father was very, very, very ill. And the love couldn't come from him because of his situation. He couldn't express it very well. Huntington's, you lose coordination of all your limbs. Basically, it was impossible to hug him. You would get hit if you came too close. So we tended, as babies, we learned to stay away. So there wasn't that physical closeness, that physical contact, but it came through his friends and the young kids that came, their love for Woody that kind of came to us through that door. And so we had this transition in the 50s, but guess what else was happening during the 50s? American Bandstand. It was irresistible. It was where we wanted to be. It was the Everly Brothers. It was Motown. And my probably most famous or funniest story that combines these two worlds is when Bob first came to New York, and he came out to Howard Beach. And we were home alone at the time. My mother was a dancer and had a dancing school in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. So she was working at the time. And there was a young girl who was a student at a parochial school. So she wore like the pleated skirt and the blazer and the knee socks. Can you see it? You all know what a parochial school uniform looks like, right? So, and she's all of 16. So we're like, 10, 11, 12, 3 of us at home. And of course, I'm watching American Bandstand that was on at 3 o'clock every day after school. And there was a knock at the door, and I went to answer it reluctantly because they were teaching you how to do the Watusi on American Bandstand. Wah, wah! Remember that? Wah, the Watusi. I will show you. I love the Watusi. And it was a knock on the door, and I ran to get it. And it was. I remember I was like in my underwear. That's how young I was. I had a little undershirt on. And I opened the door, and there was a very dusty-looking young man there. And he says, "So what do you go through here?" And I went, "Nope." Closed the door. Raced back to American Bandstand to see if I could catch the second half of the Watusi. And door knocked again. And I was like, "Oh, God." Raced to the door, like, same guy is still there. "I was told he lived here, and I was wondering if I could come in." And I said, "He's not here. We're not allowed to let anyone in the house without my mother." Closed the door again and ran back to the Watusi. And he knocked again. This is, you ask why some musicians make it and some don't.
Make what?
It.
Okay.
He was right working his destiny. Bob was working his destiny. Knock, knock, knock. Didn't you write a song that had knock, knock, knock?
Well, it was having store.
What?
That was having store.
I hear you knocking,
That's
but
what,
you
no,
can't.
that's what I'm saying. He got his lyrics from that day. That's what I'm telling you. You have no idea what an influence we were in his writing. Anyway, so knock, knock again, and I said, "Forget it, I'm not answering." The little parochial girl goes to the door, parochial school girl, and And she said, I'm sorry, I'll have to call Mrs. Guthrie and see, blah, blah, blah. So she goes to the phone and calls my mother at work. There's someone here who's very persistent and he wants to come in. Shall I let him in? Meanwhile, she's on the phone. Arlo comes down the stairs to hear what all the racket is. And he sees a guy with a guitar that's maybe like a few years older than him, which is cool. You know, Arlo's like 14 and Bob's 19. Like, whoa, that's cool. And he's, hi, hey, who are you? Hey, man. Hey, man. This is the conversation they had. You play? Yeah, you play? Yeah. Okay, that was it. And Arlo let him in. And then the girl came back and said, Mrs. Guthrie says you can wait here in the house until she gets home. I did learn the Watusi. I went back to American Bandstand. Arlo sat and played all afternoon with Bob in the living room. And my mother came home from work and we all had dinner together, etc. But the funny story, can you imagine how history would be different if I had had my way? You gotta think about that.
Bob would have had his way another way.
Think about that. I just thought it was like Arlo really changed the course of history in that moment. I could have totally steered it in another direction, or the Watusi would have become really, really big. I don't know, one of those things. But so that's kind of my, I wanted to say, because my impression of this whole time from 57 to 67, and John talked about it a little bit, there was a lot of tension between folk and folk rock, which hadn't actually happened then, but the popularization of folk and rock coming in, and then there was Motown, etc. There was a whole bunch of stuff going on, and they weren't really happy together, except in me. I was very happy with all of them, but I do remember this tension of someone, that became, the epitome of that became when Bob took up the electric guitar, that story, and everyone got so upset. And for us, it was actually totally natural for him to do that, because we were all playing electric, at that point, jamming at home with rock bands and stuff like that. And we loved folk music. And there was absolutely no tension in us about it all. And we were actually totally stunned that everyone to this day makes such a big deal about it. I just don't get it at all.
Well, were you there when Bob and Woody met?
Say it again.
When Bob and Woody got together?
Was I there when they met?
Yeah.
I wasn't there the first time that they met.
That was at the Gleason's house.
That was at the Gleasons,
Yeah.
in Greystone. But before Woody had moved to a couple of different hospitals around New York. One of them was in Flatbush, Brooklyn State Hospital. It was just, I believe, called Kings County Hospital now. And
Downstate?
Downstate, there were so many names. Brooklyn State Hospital at Kings County Downstate Hospital, something like that. But that was the first place that Bob went. And my mother was very, very sweet to him. And Bob went out there, and I have to say, I'm a staunch supporter of Bob to this day, because I saw what he did during those early days before he made a record, before anything happened. He was, every time I hear you gotta serve somebody, that's exactly what he was doing with my dad. He would go to the hospital, and he was smart enough not to play his songs to my dad, but he said to my dad, I'll play any song of yours. Now my dad was on his way out. So when you're dying, you want to have a sense, very important to have a sense of your legacy, to feel like you've left something behind on this planet, something good that you've done, that people will remember you. And so Bob was so sensitive, and he would go out there and play every single song that my dad wrote or requested. Not his own songs at all. And I think my dad was barely aware of the fact that that Bob was a songwriter in these early days. And I thought, what humility he must have had to be able to do that. Whereas a lot of the guys would come out to the hospital and say, oh, Woody Guthrie, I wrote this new song, you want to hear it? And my dad would go, not really, no. Do you know pastures aplenty? Or something like that. But without even talking about it, Bob was very, very sensitive to that. And as a lot of you probably already know, he describes himself as a Woody Guthrie jukebox in those days. That was in his own words. And he literally, quote, says, I was there to serve Woody Guthrie. And he would call my mother, and my mother said, if you're going out next week, could you bring some pencils and some yellow pads? Because my dad was still trying to write, and cigarettes. And of course, anytime you want, he would bring out all these supplies to my father. And another beautiful story that I heard about him from, I think it was Tony Glover, one of the other guys. My dad, like I said, with Huntington's, you lose control of your limbs. And it's really hard to light a cigarette. My dad was a smoker. And he would hold the match here and the cigarette here. It was just torturous to try to watch him light a cigarette. It would take 5 minutes. And most people's reaction would be to step in and try to light it. And Bob would stop them and say, no, he wants to light it himself. He's still king of the mountain. You know what I mean? And Bob didn't step on that. He didn't overstep his bounds. And he would just like, you need any help, Woody? Nope. Great. Okay. End of discussion. So there were a couple of things that I think he was so intuitive about as a man, as a human being, that I just really applaud him for those years.
You know, and during those years, Jack Elliott was around, but somehow in memory, we don't talk about Jack as much. But I remember the impression that when Bob first started sounding like Woody in New York, he sounded more like Jack's version. And Jack Elliott's closeness to Woody was very, very, very important thing.
Well,
And
Jack was in, you know Ramblin' Jack Elliott. Most of you know who he is. Not really, right? No, okay. So he was a kid from Brooklyn, and he decided to be in a rodeo. He wanted to be a cowboy, and that included riding horses and singing cowboy songs. He ran away from home when he was 15 and joined a rodeo. 16? 14. So one of those things. Anyway, he became the bridge really between the old traditional folk and then Bob Dylan and then everything that happened after that. And I'll tell you exactly, this is another story, that another knock-knock, who's there. He heard from Paley that my dad was having his appendix out. We lived at this point in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. And my dad had some stomach problems, and he was across the street in Coney Island Hospital there on Ocean Avenue, if there's any old Brooklynites here. And so the young cowboy said, oh, I hear there's another cowboy in town. He's a real cowboy named Woody Guthrie from Oklahoma. And so he goes out to the hospital to see if he can meet another singing cowboy. And Woody says, like, I have a stomachache and I really want to talk to you right now, but if you go across the street, my wife and my kids live right across the street at the apartment, and just go over and say hi to them and make friends, and she'll let you in. And that's what he did. And he stayed with us for 1.5 years. He never left. As I tell you, it's these knock-knock stories. I'm going to write a book about who has knocked on the door. Yes. My neck. Knock, knock. Who's there? Bob Dylan. Bob who? Bob Dylan who? You know what I mean? That would be funny. Okay, it's not funny.
Unfortunately, I hate to cut you guys off because this is really awesome to hear. But we are running low on time for the program this evening. I did want to open it up to audience questions, see if anybody had any stories or things that they wanted to ask John and Nora tonight. Somebody have anything? No?
Yeah.
One in the middle.
Is the whole interview in the book?
Well, this is my friend Ed Grosda, who specializes in whatever he specializes in. When I interviewed Bob Dylan, we talked for 2 or 3 sessions, and then I edited it and sent him my version, and he approved or disapproved or changed something. But there was quite a bit that I must have left out. but I must have given you the original tapes because you referred to things that are on the tapes that are not in the interview.
Right.
What were they? Do you remember? I think you would. I think you said that I showed him
You
the
showed
American.
the Americans.
I showed him Robert Frank's The American. Yeah. I also talked to Bob about Kafka, about his short stories, which I loved, and I thought that John Wesley Harding, that album was full of like Kafka short stories. That interview now, by the way, is at the Library of Congress. A few years ago, the Library of Congress acquired everything I've done, almost everything. There's some things I haven't done yet. But they have my 1,200 of my photographs and my recordings from Peru and my interviews with Bob Dylan and Harry Smith, Roscoe Holcomb, and other things. And all my films. That's all the outs from my film. So I can go on after I'm gone, and if you can look me up, I'm there at the Library of Congress. But all right, that was a question that led to a digression. No,
I was just wondering how much you and Bob actually cross paths or work together musically. There's so much else, but I never had indications of you performing together or...
That's true. We almost never performed together. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was in '62.
It took the Cuban Missile Crisis for you to perform together?
Yes. Yeah. I was home in my loft. I said, "Oh, the world's coming to an end this afternoon. The sky is coming down. I don't want to be here by myself." So I walked over to McDougal Street late afternoon, went into the Gaslight, and Bob was playing there. Hey, let's sing some songs together. What are we going to sing? You're going to miss me when I'm gone. The irony of it. Who's gonna miss us? Because we'd all be gone. But that was, I think that's the one time we played together. He came to my house, tried out my guitars, but I was so in kind of awe of his ability to use the guitar so comfortably, and that I was on my own track and it didn't really seem to work. But he knew our music. I tell you, when I saw him at Madison Square Garden one year and went backstage, and he says, "John, I really like that version of the Moonshiner." I said, "That you recorded." I said, "The Roscoe Holcomb." He said, "No, you." I said, "Did I record it?" And I didn't remember, but he did, which is interesting. In the midst of all the world that he could remember something I did, and it's fine. But you're right, we didn't play together. Another comment. Oh, here's a comment from me. On your Jalopy. On the 19th at Jalopy in Brooklyn, in Red Hook, my friends, the young band, the Downhill Strugglers, and myself will do a concert with the Blue Ridge Entertainers, two beautiful singers from North Carolina and Virginia. And we're going to show slides of my work, of pictures from the book and other pictures of my music pictures. And it should be a great evening of music. So if any of you are interested, you do have the announcement. Oh, and Nora has some things to...
Well, we have a few copies that we brought along because our lives have converged and overlapped so much. By coincidence, we had done a photo album last year called 4040 that's a photo essay. I know, Phil's here, that's why I'm there. Of my father's hospital years that in Greystone Hospital that include some information about John visiting my dad, etc., and also Dylan visiting my dad. So just because we were going to be here tonight, we brought a few copies. And the photographer is here, Phil Bueller, if you just want to stand up or raise your hand. If you want to look at his book, he's going to be signing also. And he went back to Greystone Hospital. Phil photographs ruins. And went back to Greystone Hospital and did these really gorgeous photo essays of the hospital now emptied out, etc. And we were able to combine it with interviews and comments from people who knew Woody and worked with him and visited him there during these years. And John is in our book. So I'm in his book, he's in my book. And this is one of these beautiful photos. This is how, at the Gleason's apartment.
It was a publisher's, it was a reception for his reissuing of.
No, that's Sid Gleason right there. Yeah. Anyway, if you want to see what John looked like in 1965 or 4, something like that, and Phil Buell is here, and he brought a couple of books to sign as well. And that's the photos that John is talking about that he should have been in, but
Well, that Jack Elliott was
Ramblin'
a
Jack
surrogate.
Elliott in one of the last visits there. So we have a few copies here that we brought in thinking, geez, it's our people.
Wonderful. We do have additional copies of John's book available at the back of the room as well. On behalf of the Strand, thank you so much, John and Nora, for joining us tonight. Thank you all for coming.